Hi, I am Fatima. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak today about a topic that I so strongly feel. I'll start with a quote and then get on with my presentation. Quite a few years ago, I read this somewhere that masked events scar the memory of the individual and communities they touch. They have the capacity to forever change the character of life, lifestyle of individuals and communities. And they confront one's perception of the world and individual and collective vulnerability and strength. With this, I would like to tell you a little bit more about myself. I did my PhD looking at the influence of living under ongoing terrorism and how that trauma and stress influences employee behaviors. In my learnings from my own research was that living under ongoing terrorism creates an ongoing fear in the hearts of people. So, what I will do in today's talk is I'll first talk about the effect of prolonged exposure to terrorism, and then I'll link it to how it leads to polarization within communities, and how then it affects discrimination, especially in terms of workplaces. And in the second part, I will discuss what are the lessons that we have learned from this prolonged exposure to terror and how can we apply them to the context of the pandemic, the COVID-19. You might think, what do living under terrorism and COVID have in common? It's fear of losing a loved one, fear of life, injury, trauma, grief, stress, anxiety, loss of income, relationships, and the ongoing nature of it. And what it eventually means for marginalized workers and their well-being. So this is sort of the focus of what I want to unpack in today's conversation. The reality of death causes fear in people. It can happen to me or you. We call it death salience. It is when we are reminded of our death. So, why am I talking about this fear of death? Because I'm a researcher within management science scholarship, and there is very limited focus in management science theory on the effect of this fear of death, this death salience caused by terrorism or, for that matter, the pandemic, which can lead to increased intolerance and discriminatory behaviors. That too, in the workplaces as well. So, how does death salience become a problem? Why is it a problem? Perhaps if we understand this part of the puzzle, we will be able to understand quite a big problem that is prevalent and might grow into bigger issues in the coming future. There is an argument that humans are in constant struggle between the desire to live and the knowledge of inevitability of death. Scholars agree that there's a universal anxiety associated with one's death, which is the primary function of human behavior. This fear of death consequentially can cause many other behaviors. So, what do humans do in such situations Human work towards self preservation and validation. This fear makes people focus on their purpose of life, validation for their own worldviews. It makes them gravitate towards those who are similar, who they can trust, who will validate them, because it gives them a sense of warmth, it gives us a sense of safety, better self esteem. It also buffers our anxiety caused by our fear of death. But what it also does is it draws us away from those whom we think as others. So the arguments that I have been presenting are largely based on the terror management theory, which talks about death salience, fear, terror of death, where people try to look for meaning of their life, almost like they are looking for something like a symbolic immortality. So they gravitate towards those who are similar, who will validate their worldviews. This draws us closer to those who are like us and away from those who are different from us, which means that we start becoming closer and closer with those whom we trust. There becomes like a in-group cohesion, and it moves us away from those whom we consider different. You see where I'm going with this? So this leads to discrimination and greater polarity within communities. And later, I will talk about then marginalized communities who are already excluded and considered others. But let's now focus on terrorism and feeling prolonged exposure to terrorism and this sense of fear of death and how we can relate it to COVID. So there are a few studies done in management science, some in political theory, which try to look into death salience and how it affects employees and employee behaviors. The idea behind this whole notion is that when people are constantly living under terrorism, or now, like I'm giving the example of the context of COVID, they're constantly reminded of death. And what I am trying to argue for is that the research has often looked at one-time incidents, one act of terrorism, one incident where someone was reminded of death. The argument here is that when it goes on for so long, it can have far stronger and bigger implications for people. It is an important area which needs research, both during pandemic and afterwards. So let's talk about this prolonged exposure to fear and terrorism and build a little bit on it. It can become a chronic stress, something constant that one lives with day in and day out. There is a whirlwind of grief, sadness, helplessness, skepticism, anger, and mistrust. When we look at prolonged exposure to trauma and terrorism, or in case of COVID, it's going to have impacts. It is going to impact people's lives, not just today, but for a very long time. And for some, in fact, for a lifetime. Because what is happening at the moment is that we are torn between feeling guilty for trying to avoid pain and trying to live normally, often thinking about, trying not to think about others who are mourning for their losses. Sometimes we are feeling numb and senseless because it makes us think, how can we be even rational to be living our day-to-day routine lives while so much is happening around us? So when we put all these findings that we have already learned from living under terrorism and sort of juxtapose it against COVID, we see that this constant media projection of what is happening, of the deaths, of the disease, creates an ongoing sense of fear and helplessness. But it's also making people retrench into their own circles, away from those that they do not know. It has created the idea of others, because the virus can attack anyone, anywhere. So people are only connecting with those whom they can trust, that they will be cautious, so they will not catch the disease. In a broader sense, it almost creates an environment of distrust and fear towards others. It is kind of similar to how people feel when they are living under ongoing terrorism. There is a constant threat. Anything can happen, anywhere, anytime. People avoid crowded places where people don't know others. And so this distrust and fear becomes kind of a part of our subconscious. But that's not it. We constantly hear from media, and everything is sounding so unpredictable all the time. Whereas human would like to have predictability and control. So what do we do? There are a couple of things in how people deal with it. They either say they're used to it, habituation. They hear something on the news, they hear about a death, they hear about people being sad, and they episodically feel frustrated, upset, or empathetic. But overall, there becomes a sense of helplessness. And that feeling of helplessness almost becomes normal. So, with the helplessness and stress and trauma, there is a higher vulnerability because it depletes you. So people start avoiding situations which will increase their anxiety or fear. So if we kind of put all of this together, we see that we start desensitizing ourselves from what's happening around us. It's a coping mechanism. How else would we survive? We can't constantly keep feeling the pain of what is happening around. We start becoming closer to our own groups. And this sense of desensitization and helplessness becomes a new normal. So now I would like to put the bits that I have discussed more like how they happen and where they lead to, so that I can go on to my next step of how it will influence our marginalized community. In a nutshell, prolonged exposure to fear and trauma leads to this constant reminder of death. which brings us closer to and within our own circles, away from those who are different. But because it depletes our overall well-being, we start losing patience, we become anxious, and at the same time, we try to desensitize ourselves to the constant losses. It leads to us being divided and desensitized towards others' vulnerability and loss. Some might say it hardens our hearts towards loss, trauma, vulnerability, and others. So now I would like to connect this with what are the implications for marginalized people. We are seeing that one key consequence of the pandemic is a global mental health crisis. And it is true for everyone, but it has far more devastating effects on minorities. It's like the pandemic has been discriminating as well. We already have statistics which show that people of color, migrants, LGBT communities, women are more at disadvantage during COVID. Both in terms of job and income loss, work-life imbalances, but also in terms of the far-reaching detrimental consequences of poor well-being. It's not like they weren't already marginalized. They were already not trusted. They were already considered as others, discriminated, excluded, and vulnerable in terms of well-being. But when we add this into our collective picture, we see that discrimination towards marginalized people will increase. Because people, especially people of privilege, are likely to become more cohesive, less trusting towards more cohesive within themselves and less trusting of those whom they consider others. They will become closer to those who have similar worldviews, who will validate them, which means that those who are different, their views, because of their lack of position, are going to be even more suppressed. And overall, it'll create sort of another layer of disadvantage, exclusion, discrimination, and polarity, and which will have especially adverse effects, far-reaching, for those who are in the marginalized population. So with this, I'll like to conclude and point that terror management theory and death salience hasn't been widely researched, especially in the management and business science, management science and business domain. Less in the context of terrorism, even lesser in the context of pandemic, where we can tell, looking at the literature, that it can have far negative and long-term consequences for our marginalized population. So that's about it. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I hope you found this conversation, this talk useful. Feel free to contact me. Thank you.